podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam. This is All Across America. All right, Kate, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
So you're a professor of cultural media studies at the New School in New York City, and you've recently released a book called School Yearbook, The Untold Story of a Cringey Tradition and Its Digital Afterlife. So we're here to talk about high school yearbooks, and you're not the most likely person to be talking about yearbooks with. You open the book by describing the scene of throwing away your own yearbooks. What made you finally decide to do it?
Between the ages of about 18 and maybe 37, 38, which is when I originally moved from Canada to New York City, I moved a lot. I mean, I'm talking, I probably had a new address every year. And so I was moving around this box, which was all taped up. I never opened it. It had the high school yearbooks in it. And I think there was this moment when I had just gone through this very sort of, onerous and expensive move across the border. And I thought, why do I still have this box? I mean, I'm never going to look at this again because I couldn't face what was in it. You know, the pictures of myself from high school, the comments, the whole thing. And I was no longer in touch with anyone from my high school. And it felt incredibly liberating just to be like, that's over. What I wasn't anticipating, of course, and that would have been around 2007, 2008, I don't think at that time I was anticipating that 500,000 yearbooks would end up being digitized, floating around on the internet for anyone to see. And I don't think most people would have anticipated that sort of scale of digitization at that time, particularly not for documents that, I think in the past, people were concerned with their own high school yearbook, but not really with yearbooks in general. Would you agree?
I would say so. Yeah. Yes. I still have mine. I still have all four of them.
That says, obviously, you can psychoanalyze me or vice versa. But, I think that one's attachment to their high school yearbook is also a very interesting conversation unto itself.
They're heavy and they're at my parents' house. And I mean, I'm still in touch with a couple of folks. And, I was before this conversation thinking back on my high school years. And I guess the best thing that I could say about it, which is a really good thing, is that they were kind of uneventful for me. I was the oldest of three children. My parents were, I would say, more on the stricter side, and I didn't do a lot of growing up in high school. I played some sports, and I was a good student, and then I went off into the world, and that's where more, I think, eventful things in my life happened. I still have all four of my high school yearbooks from freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior year.
Well, that also says something about your age and also my age, because I also had all four yearbooks. And so historically, it was really only graduates who would purchase the books.
Right.
And then around the mid 20th century, they started to put photographs of, all the classes in. The focus was more on the entire school. And so there's this time, I think, probably from the 1950s, maybe up until the early 2000s, where it wasn't unusual for someone in 9th or 10th or 11th grade also to purchase the yearbook. My observation is now that they've become more, they almost have the function of, like in the same way that if you go to a Broadway play and you get a playbill, some people collect them. They're almost more like a collector's item now, but they don't have the same value for young people because, of course, they have all those photographs of their friends on their social media platforms. So we're part of a very sort of discrete sort of maybe generation or two who would have all four volumes.
It's interesting because I'm such a fan of tangible items. And I remember going to a wedding in my wife's family, and they took out a trove of photos from a shoebox, and there were 10 of us around going through that. And what will happen to the digital photos? I mean, we just take too many of them. They're just become ephemera. We still do family yearbooks. And because of that, every year we put out just a family book on hardcover through Apple with a dust jacket, the whole thing. And I feel like our kids will look through that more than they will some soon to be, destroyed hard drive. I don't know. I do find them to be important documents, but surprising that they've become digitized in such a way. Has your own high school yearbook been digitized?
As far as I know, it hasn't been. But again, this is partly because I grew up in Canada. Fortunately, I might be protected by this. Had I grown up in the US, it's almost certain that it would be on Ancestry, and I don't know, my high school yearbook could be on Ancestry. I haven't looked because I'm trying to avoid it, but I'm like an advertisement for repression, right? But so I the it's highly likely, though, had I grown up in the US, it would either be on Ancestry or on the Internet Archive for a variety of reasons.
So was it because of did you learn about this digitization of these 500,000 volumes? I mean, what brought you to write, about something that you seem to be you were somewhat ambivalent about?
I mean, there's a few different things. I spent my entire career, both writing about media and memory, and I've also written a lot about archives, and so I had just finished a manuscript called The End of Forgetting, which came out in 2019, but when that manuscript I was just doing the final edits, it was maybe fall 2018, coincided with Brett Kavanaugh's nomination hearing. And there was that strange 2 weeks, right, after the New York Times broke the article where they had gone back to his high school yearbook. There was this question about, whether or not he was the kind of person who would have committed a sexual assault when he was in high school. And to research his character, right? Because he claimed to be this upstanding, religious, studious
Very
young.
pious, yes. I remember he had a calendar of, the
Well,
1980s. Yeah,
and the
I
mom's
was
calendar that she took out of the basement and said, "No, no, look, he was just working out and just studying and praying. That's all he was doing." Um, so the New York Times reporters looked at his high school yearbook, which, by the way, is available on the Internet Archive. It took me about 5 seconds to find it. There it is. And started to analyze it, and very soon realized that there is this sort of repeated reference to Renata alumni. I believe that was the phrase, which they realized was something that all of the members of the football team had written at some point in the yearbook, and, pointed to his, maybe less pious behaviors in high school,
Mm,
let's say.
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So it was used, so there was that 2 period when oddly we were all people across the United States and around the world were actually looking at this guy's high school yearbook, which struck me as very unusual and peculiar and interesting. And in the nomination hearing, he was grilled about his high school yearbook, and he used the word cringy to describe it. So one of the reasons why that the word cringy wasn't originally in the subtitle of the book, but my editor at the University of Chicago Press suggested I put it in the subtitle. And it felt cringy to do that, but it also felt appropriate.
Well, on brand.
Yes.
I mean, whatever side of the political spectrum you are, I think we can all agree that your books can be very cringy. I mean, anybody at, 16, 17, 18. I mean, that's just kind of you're discovering yourself.
No,
And
exactly. But it's interesting, like, originally, to come back to your question, I mean, that was I started to think a bit more about yearbooks as memory albums, and I originally thought that I would write a book that was, in fact, thinking about high school yearbooks as a form of pre-digital social media, because they, in fact, share a lot in common with
of course.
social media platforms. They're a template, they're very visually driven, they're comprised of user-generated content. They're examples of media where the people who are making the media are also the audience. But once I started to research the history of school yearbooks, I realized they were so much more disturbing than I had actually anticipated, and there was so much more to say. So that's a bit of the background of how this project came into being.
So you said there's 500,000 that have been digitized, and you talk a lot in the book about the public versus semi-public aspect of the yearbook. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think most of us would agree that when you agreed to have your photograph back in a yearbook, especially in pre-digital era, there was a sense that it might circulate, it might be published in a print run of 300 or maybe 1,000, depending on how large your high school was and how many people were going to purchase yearbooks. But it was a very limited sort of limited context. And it was seen as a sort of there's no ISBN, right? If you think about a regular book, there's an ISBN.
Right.
It just circulates in a different way. So it's almost although they have always been produced for a few hundred people at least, they weren't really public in the way that most books are, where there's an ISBN, it's sold in a bookstore, etc. The problem is there's a lot of ambiguity about their status as public or private. And so depending on, when I was working on the book, there were people from both schools and from historical societies who were like, well, if a school yearbook is produced at a public school, probably is somehow offset by taxpayers' dollars, and it is public by default because of that. On the other hand, somewhere like New York City, I noticed very quickly, I couldn't find virtually no New York City yearbooks online. Certainly not any that were not like behind some kind of paywall. And I realized it's because there was a time in the 1990s when Giuliani was actually encouraging the New York Police Department to collect not only high school yearbooks, but also middle school yearbooks to use them basically as mug books, right? So you could use them to help identify potential suspects in usually quite, petty crimes. When parents and teachers and students found out this was happening, there was an enormous backlash. And in the end, in New York City, school yearbooks are treated as private educational records. So depending on the jurisdiction, a yearbook can be seen as public by default or private by default.
Hmm. And for private schools?
Private schools, some of them have over time ended up online, some of them haven't. They have a different function though. If you think about a public school's yearbook is almost like a shareholders report historically. It's like evidence that your tax dollars are being, not squandered, right?
Right.
Which is why even cash-strapped schools would often invest in a yearbook. They would offset the cost because it had a public function. Private schools have tended to always use their yearbook as a really elaborate brochure to promote all the amazing things that, you're purchasing when you write that check to them.
The crew and the rowing club and squash
Exactly.
and
Right?
yes.
It's like a very, kind of just, an expensive brochure. So depending on the context, they can be seen as public or private or somewhere in between. When it comes to copyright, there's also ambiguity because in some cases, some of them are copyrighted, some of them aren't.
Wow.
Yeah,
Mm,
they're very
and
messy.
they they really are, and you had a quote in the book, "Exercises in self-mythologizing, how people want to be remembered, not how they were." Can you
Yes.
talk a little bit about that?
I mean, I think about school yearbooks, and again, this is very different because we now have very young kids on social media already thinking at, 9 or 10 or 12 about how to craft a kind of public reputation and how to manage their public reputation. And in some ways that, they're often obsessed with this. But if you go back to, the 80s or earlier or the 90s even, the only place that you would have done that probably as an adolescent, unless you were a child celebrity, is in your yearbook. So it's
Right.
almost like reputation management 101, right? Like it's that first chance to, you know, think about how you're going to frame yourself for the public, but also how you're going to be remembered in the future.
Right, I mean, that is another precursor to social media in the same way that people curate their lives and, they're only showing the best of their lives and, the travel versus, not the day-to-day taking out the trash. I mean, I guess the yearbook was an early part of that. And then, thinking back to social media, Facebook was originally called the Facebook. So I think there's a almost a direct line between the high school yearbook and social media in some respects. I mean, particularly that it started at Harvard.
There is. I mean, there's people often think about Facebook though as being the first example of social networking or social, I guess specifically of social networking. Sometimes people cite 6 Degrees, which goes back to the 90s as the first example of a social networking site. But one of the surprising things I discovered when I was working on this book is the first social networking site was actually classmates.com. And it was started about a year before 6 Degrees. Mark Zuckerberg was still in middle school when it started. And it was a place where you could you could connect with people you knew in high school who you were no longer in touch with, and you could do it online. Understandably, Randy Comrades, who had previously been an executive at Boeing, but I guess he saw the potential to use the internet for this thing called social networking. He decided that one way to entice people to get a subscription to classmates.com, which was about $36 back in the late 90s, early 2000s, at a time when people still imagined that social media sites might have a subscription, that one way to entice them would be to promise that if they logged on, they could get a copy, they might be able to get access to their high school yearbook, which they no longer had because maybe they had lost it or thrown it out like I did. And so, as it turned out, school yearbooks actually played a very significant role in scaling the first social networking site. Ultimately, that site would fail because by 2008 to 2009, why would you get a subscription to Classmates when you could go onto Facebook for free?
Right. Well,
Yeah.
nothing's free, but
Well, exactly. That's before, so Mark, that's before we were all talking about digital labor and what we were giving up in terms of our privacy and our
yes.
time. We didn't know about, most of us weren't thinking about that yet in 2008.
Yes, it's classmates.com seems to be a business model from another era, I guess.
Well, people who would go on to work at the company have said it's like, even though it was basically the the business model for Facebook was presented to the board of to their board at one point, to their executive board, and they rejected it. And so it could have been Facebook, but they chose a business model that was of an analog, not a digital era, and that sort
right.
of, yeah. So at one point, it was one of the most lucrative digital companies, which is kind of shocking now that it was making more money than Ancestry.
And they became the blockbuster video of their segment.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a really good analogy. It's like the, Blockbuster's relationship to Netflix or something.
Exactly. They had that opportunity as well. One of the most interesting things about your books and in your book was this sense of the color bias in film. And you wrote how, I guess, color photography was developed around the the skin color of a white woman, and Black people, they would appear in yearbooks very, very dark and very dark hues. And yearbooks were one of the first places to bring that, pardon the pun, to light.
Yeah, so when color film was introduced, it was designed in a way that had a sort of built-in bias toward photographing all white audiences, right? As school yearbooks, it's actually interesting. You'll sometimes see school yearbooks, particularly in schools where there's a diversity of students. They'll try out a color yearbook for a few years and then they'll go back to black and white. And in some cases, I don't know if it's hard to tell in retrospect whether or not that was financial or if that was due to the fact that they were struggling to have, a photograph of a team or a class with students from all sorts of different racial backgrounds. Kodak learned about this from parents who started to complain because they would get their students' class pictures and not be able to see their students. So African
Mm.
American families would be like, "Where is my kid? They've disappeared." Although Kodak learned about this early on, they didn't actually start to address the color bias in their film until manufacturers, including manufacturers of chocolate and dark furniture, which was very popular in the late 1960s and 70s. That's when they started to respond to the color bias in their film. It wasn't
Wow.
actually a response to the parents' complaints, but there's evidence that the company was aware of it.
Wow.
Yeah. So in the way, yearbooks are terribly racist in an overt way. But as I was working on the book, I started to also think about how there was a kind of discrimination by design that also
Right.
shapes the history of school yearbooks.
It's interesting, and maybe we can turn to more overt forms of racism. When I had emailed you, I told you the story of how I couldn't have a yearbook quote in my 1996 Fox Lane High School yearbook in Bedford, New York, because of an incident that had occurred the previous year, Greenwich High School, which is located just a few miles away in Connecticut. And sure enough, it appeared in your book, which I was really surprised to see. Can you talk a little bit about that incident and
Yeah, I
others?
mean, that was and first of all, it's also important to say that when I started to look for incidents of racism in school yearbooks or reports about it, they don't even show up until maybe the early to mid 1970s. You start to see some articulated concerns about racism in school yearbooks. Prior to that, either people didn't feel empowered to complain or they didn't even notice it was happening. But by 1995, 96, you have quite a few sort of, every year there's these incidents that come up. The one that happened close to where you went to high school, a student looked at her yearbook and realized there was a series of random looking letters inserted into the caption under her image, which turned out to be a racist reference. The students who were responsible for it were never really, I mean, they were sort of chastised, but nothing, they still graduated. Nothing severe happened to them. It was an awful instant, though, because another group of students ended up retaliating because they were very angry about the way the incident had been handled. And unlike the young white men who were responsible for the original alteration of the yearbook and the racist comment, who just kind of went on with their lives, the young visible minority men who retaliated later that summer ended up being arrested. And when I was doing my research, I include many examples of racism in high school yearbooks in the book, but I could have written a whole book just on race and
Right.
racial relations in schools and how they're represented in yearbooks. And the challenges students have representing any kind of resistance to racism in yearbooks to this day. So if we jump ahead to 2020, there were some yearbooks, particularly in places like Florida and some other places in the South, where students just wanted to mention, a timeline of news events that happened that year. And they would just mention Black Lives Matter. And in some
Right.
cases, either the school board or the school administration would not let them distribute the yearbook because they had just mentioned Black Lives Matter in the book.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So it's not, this is an ongoing issue.
And so, before we turn to the Supreme Court ruling, the Hazelwood Supreme Court ruling, I did want to get back to is I wanted to share my school yearbook quote that never was, and I stand by it to this day. And I was all set. I had the quote, and of course, as I said earlier, we were not allowed to include a quote at all. But my quote was, and my favorite musician at the time was Jimi Hendrix. I'm still a Jimi Hendrix fan, and the quote was, "And so castles made of sand slip into the sea eventually." And it was talking about the ephemeral nature of high school, of the time, the relationships. And I look back upon it and I said, I did a lot of silly things as a 17-year-old, but I like that one. And I wish I could have included that. So
That's actually very self-reflexive. It's very meta.
Yes, I
You're
think so,
commenting on
and
the format at
yeah,
school. Why couldn't you include it?
because of what happened in Greenwich.
So they wouldn't let you include
No
any
quotes at all. No quotes. Our entire yearbook was if I remember correctly, we were told to, think of a quote, and then we received notice some months later that it wasn't happening because of, some more recent incidents, and that direct incident in Greenwich affected probably high school yearbooks for years to come in that general area. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, but that also draws attention to something that I found that there is often a sort of over-indexing after there's an incident, right? So the yearbook, I think because it's so unwieldy for first of all, you have a teacher who's already overworked and underpaid. Usually someone young who, got hired in the English department and is told, "By the way, if you want this job, you have to." I
They're
interviewed
voluntold to be the yearbook supervisor.
no, told, "If you want this job, you have to also be the yearbook editor." So I actually interviewed several former yearbook editors who are now all university professors, and when they were, 22 or 23, right out of, like, it was their first job, they were basically told, "If you want the job, you have to do this," and they just had to learn overnight how to do basic desktop publishing and put out this yearbook.
Right.
And, sometimes those yearbooks can be 300 pages, so
Oh,
who has
easily.
time to go through and analyze every single final statement? So it's particularly in a large public school, you could see why the staff member and the principal would just say, "No quotes," right?
Yeah. Yes, just that's it. Yeah, no
I
quotes,
feel I
done.
feel bad for you. I also agree that was a great choice, Mark, and I
Yeah.
just hope that someday you could just go online and create your own yearbook and just look at you could relive it.
So, let's talk about the Hazelwood Supreme Court ruling because that led to a lot of sanitization of yearbooks, we'll call it.
Well, it did and it didn't. So Hazelwood happens in the early 1980s. Yearbook decides that they want to have coverage of two things. They mention something about divorce, and they also mention something about pregnant teens. And I believe there was an image of someone in the school who was pregnant. The school decides that's not the image they want to put out. Once again, coming back to, the taxpayers, right? Like, this is not the image that some principals or, school trustees or superintendents want to project of the school. And the editor decided to dispute this. And it ended up going all the way to the Supreme Court, didn't get there until the poor editor had probably graduated from college by the time it got to the Supreme Court, which I think was 1987. But they did rule in favor of schools and decided that school yearbooks, along with school newspapers, are part of the curriculum, and therefore student journalists in that context do not have all the same rights as other journalists. So essentially, that ruling made it much easier for school principals, s- supervisors, school trustees, superintendents to censor school journalists. I would argue, though, that if you look through yearbooks going back to the 19th century, they've always been subject to a lot of censorship. So all Hazelwood really did was entrench something that already existed. Yeah.
Codified it.
I will add, though, that in recent years, there's been an effort on a state by state basis to try to reestablish rights for student journalists. And there's been some success. I think it's going to be very difficult, though, in the current climate where where schools will be at risk of losing their funding in some cases
I see.
if, certain types of content appear in their student newspapers and school yearbooks. So it'll be interesting to watch what happens over the next few years, even in states that have reestablished some rights for student journalists.
See. And so Hazelwood applies not only to yearbooks, but also to student newspapers, and it also applies to colleges as well?
Hazelwood primarily applies the way it's been taken up is it's primarily applied to K to 12.
Okay.
At the college level, it would be much, much more difficult, but also probably work against the institution to try to censor its student newspapers or yearbooks. Also, yearbooks, it's interesting. Yearbooks were once very prevalent at the college level, and very few colleges have them anymore. So
Yeah.
really a K to
Yes.
12 and mostly a 9 to 12 activity.
I mean, can you imagine the University of Michigan having a yearbook, for instance? It would
No,
be
exactly, right.
10,000 pages long.
Yeah, no, in a Canadian context, yeah, like, you often have your like, a school like the University of Toronto, which has about 80,000 students, or I think about here in New York City, a CUNY, right? I guess you could have
Right.
one for the college, but the whole system is over 200,000 students.
Yeah, impossible. So we talked about, I mean, some of the sanitization, I mean, of tattoos, of cleavage. Did it become more pronounced? I mean, it was almost like Hazelwood gave a carte blanche to school administrators to kind of, wield their stick in any way they felt necessary.
Yeah, and I just sort of think about, like, can you imagine, okay, you're, I don't know, in charge of the high school yearbook. You're a teacher. You're already overworked, underpaid, but you're like, I'm just gonna go through and put all the images into Photoshop, and I'm just gonna delete all the tattoos, piercings, and any cleavage, right? Like, who has time to do that? It's very bizarre to me that someone would feel so passionate about upholding the school's dress code that they would actually want to do that. But this has happened, and recently, there's been several cases where usually it's young women who open up their yearbook and think, "That's not the shirt I was wearing," or, "What happened to my tattoo?" Who end up having to complain about this. So there's also something very gendered about how this sort of weird morality photoshopping is deployed.
Yeah, and you look at some of these pictures, and I mean, it's almost barely noticeable, and it makes me wonder if there were, as you mentioned, that some of these jobs were contingent upon being the yearbook editor, and maybe they were untenured young teachers who were just afraid of losing their job for any variable, and were just so scared that
Well,
Photoshop was their means of
y
safety and security.
no, and it's the same as there's an incident I talk about in the book, which happened, I feel like it was maybe in the early 2000s in New Jersey. This is, by the time students were now able to purchase a page at the back of the book and put a photograph or a message, right? So this young man takes out half a page, has some pictures of him and his friends, and he has a picture of himself kissing his boyfriend. At the graduation ceremony, the graduation dinner, the principal of the high school realizes there's a gay kiss in the yearbook and arrives with, hundreds of copies of the yearbook and a box of Sharpies, and tells all the teachers that they have to, before the yearbooks are distributed, Sharpie out the gay kiss. Later, some of them would actually tell journalists, because this ended up being reported on in places like The Advocate, that they were forced to do it. So there is something about, sometimes these acts of censorship are not driven by the teachers, but
Right.
they feel like they need to do it in order to, be in compliance with rules related to their job.
And you talked about these school ads, and it was a switch in the business model of, it used to be local advertisements, and then it changed to personalized messages. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so until the early 2000s, or maybe until, it's probably a bit earlier than that, maybe it was until the late 1990s or something, school yearbooks would have paid ads from local businesses. And so there'd be an ad from, like, the used car lot and the furniture store and the
And the dry
funeral,
cleaner.
the dry cleaners. In fact, I was actually talking to sociologist Michael Mesmer, just published a book called The High School. And in his book, which is a bit different because it focuses on one school, but he was telling me that when he was in high school, they would also get students from the high school to go and pose in these photographs. So he actually told me that he posed in a photograph at a furniture store with his girlfriend from high school, sort of like leaning against a sofa or something, right? Which I thought was actually really funny. But by the time paid advertising changes with the arrival of the internet, people stop getting these ads in school yearbooks. It's no longer a good return on investment for businesses, and it doesn't really make sense anymore. So instead, you have people taking out sort of vanity ads. And that actually has a profound impact on how people feel about yearbooks. So a lot of younger people, particularly younger millennials and particularly Gen Zs, kind of think about school yearbooks as a place where, you know, students whose family have a lot of money get to take up more space in the book.
Mm,
And so it does keep yearbooks alive more or less, although they're very expensive, but they always have been. But it's made yearbooks less, let's say, democratic than they were in the past.
right. Almost, the bigger braggarts are ones with the bigger wallets.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
A and so you've seen, I'd imagine, thousands of yearbooks, and what are some of the trends that have persisted over the years, and what has changed?
I mean, what's bizarre is very little has changed. I mean, youth culture is so dynamic, it's always evolving. But if you look at a yearbook from 1925 or 1935, and you look at a yearbook that was published last year, has basically the same features.
Wow.
There's a little message at the beginning, usually from the principal or the assistant principal. You have pictures of the staff, you have pictures of the graduating class, they have the teams, the clubs, maybe some bad poetry, usually some bad graphic design. There's space at the
Right.
back to leave your autographs and your
Right.
messages to your friends.
Yes.
And those elements, like probably the thing that has changed most is that as opposed to having that picture from the funeral home or the butcher or the used car lot, you now have those sort of vanity advertisements purchased by families and students at the back. Other than
Yeah.
that, though, the actual format of the book is kind of disturbingly similar.
Hmm. Are superlatives still there? The class clown, the most likely to succeed, the, I don't know, cutest couple,
In some books, yeah. Some books still
interesting.
have, not to the same extent. That's actually a good point, Mark. I would say that for certainly in the mid-20th century, those were often, it was kind of like a central feature of the book. I think that at some point they kind of fell to the wayside. And that maybe just reflects broader changes in high schools where they're trying to be, less hierarchical, at least in certain types of public schools. Yeah. Yeah. And you still have though, like, and it depending on the school, you still
Yeah.
have focus on the football team, you still have focus on the king and queen, unless it's a school like LaGuardia High School in New York City where my daughter went. They sometimes just have a king and king or a queen and queen because it's a
Wow, okay.
school in New York City, but,
Right.
uh, some of those features are still there. But what you
Yes.
see though, I think it's pretty rare to see in a contemporary book, like, the most attractive couple or
Okay.
yeah, I think that's
Right.
kind of fallen out of style for the most part.
Makes sense. I mean, and if there were ever a high school in New York City that should have its yearbooks digitized, it would be LaGuardia.
Yeah, and unfortunately, they don't. So, when I was doing my research, I mean, I had access to a few of those books because I had a child who went to the school. I also wanted to get access to the, Stuyvesant High School yearbook,
Right.
because I was really curious to see how they accounted for 9/11 because Stuyvesant
Yeah.
High School was literally students it was so close, students rushed to the windows of their classrooms and watched the Twin Towers falling. And then they
Right.
were actually evacuated from their school for over 2 months because it was taken over by the federal authorities while they were just doing their investigation down there. But to get access to that yearbook, I knew a teacher at the school who was able to put me in touch with a student she remembered from that class, and he scanned a few pages for me, but technically or in order to even just look at the book, I was supposed to have gone through their alumni association and got permission.
Right. Right.
So to come back to that question about public and private books, I mean, in New York, at some high schools, you have to get layers and layers of permission just to look at the book.
Wow. And just for some context for folks outside the New York City area, LaGuardia is the performing arts high school, home of the movie Fame, with
Yeah.
many famous performing arts alumni. Stuyvesant is long considered the number one public high school in the city, and it was literally on the right next to Ground Zero. And can you talk particularly about Stuyvesant, and you did in the book about how it memorialized September 11th in that year's yearbook?
It was interesting. Stuyvesant has a very good student newspaper, so they actually most of their coverage of 9/11 ended up in this 80-page newspaper they put out, which was actually even at one point distributed. There were a certain number of copies that were distributed by the New York Times, and it was like students reporting and photographs and
I remember that.
the yearbook. In the flyleaf at the beginning, there are some sort of images or sort of references to 9/11, but there's really only 2 pages in the book that reference 9/11, and it was interesting to me that both of the pieces submitted were collectively written, so they weren't authored by a single student, and it almost functions as a kind of sort of collective testimony to what the students in that school's experience. Yeah.
And
So
you
kind
said
of
during COVID.
serious moment in a school
Yeah.
year.
Yeah. And you said during COVID, because it happened so late in the school year, that it really was glossed over.
Well, it's one of the bizarre things about school yearbooks. If you look at, I mean, to go back to Columbine in the early, that when Columbine happened, it's not referenced in the school yearbook either, because school yearbooks tend
Wow.
to go to the publisher in sometimes late February or March.
Right.
So it's
Okay.
supposed to be a representation of a year of in the life of a school, but it never is,
It's
right?
first 6 months.
In the case of the Parkland shooting, the publisher actually gave them an extra 6 weeks to essentially redo the yearbook to account for that tragedy, which happened in February, but that was actually quite unusual that that was even possible. In most cases, if something happens sort of after a certain point in the school year, it just doesn't exist, including the pandemic. So there's a few publishers that gave schools a chance to put in one page about the fact, oh, and suddenly the school year just ended, and
Right.
so there's a bit of pandemic, but a lot of 2020 yearbooks never mention the pandemic, which is very odd. And of course, most of those yearbooks have no autographs at the front or back either. So
Right. Okay.
yeah, they're kind of marked by an absence more than a presence of content.
So in terms of autographs and, the inscriptions and some of those that you viewed online, were they, I don't know, naked yearbooks, or were these yearbooks that had been owned by a student who had inscriptions in them, or was it kind of a mix of?
It's mixed. So if you go on to the Internet Archive, which anyone can do, you'll find some yearbooks have obviously been scanned directly from a public library or from a school library.
Right.
You'll also find scans of yearbooks full of people's comments and personal messages, and some of
So
those are really
strange.
quite amusing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what are, in reviewing all of these thousands of yearbooks, any quotes, any bizarre images that stuck out to you?
Honestly, Mark, there's just so many. It just
I know. It's like it's way too many.
I mean, but again, like, I think what actually what I remember most looking at all those, thousands of yearbooks is that the types of images that you would see in a yearbook from the 20s or 30s and from the 80s or from the present have often changed less than you would expect. There's a few exceptions, though. So, there was a yearbook. Again, this is a yearbook that had from Massachusetts. It was, I think, in the 80s, racist incident due to something that had been written beside a student's, you know, personal statement, right? It had been edited at the last minute and ended up including the N word. So
Mm.
the high school principal in that case redacted that from apparently all the yearbooks. But what was amazing is when I looked at the yearbook, if you flip ahead just 3 or 4 pages, there's Halloween costumes, and one of them is someone dressed up as a Klansman.
Wow.
So, like, what's changed is I would say that you probably would not see that in a high school yearbook in the United States in 2025. So there's been some
Definitely not.
changes.
Definitely not.
But in general, the types of images and content has remained very, very similar.
My favorite, I guess, I photo collage of the yearbooks, and you've probably come across this, it's a meme on social media, is this one teacher wore the same outfit for 40 years in a row for his entire career, and there's a collection of all of these 40 photographs of him wearing the exact same shirt, which was, like, straight out of the late 1970s, brown, big collars, and I thought it was cute in a fun way.
That's amazingly convenient though too, right? So he just ended up becoming himself from a different period, from a different time.
Pretty much. I mean, the only thing that changed was his hair color.
That's awesome.
So, I mean, in doing this so we began the conversation, you threw away your yearbooks. Have you reflected has it caused you to reflect back on your own high school days, your own youth, and having done this?
I mean, I don't know if it's changed how I think about my own high school experience. It has definitely changed how I think about and historicize youth media making practices, though. And so I think about social media as part of a much longer history of media making now than I did before working on this. I also, obviously, I already thought that school yearbooks were kind of cringy and embarrassing and maybe something I didn't really want to look at. I would definitely say after 4 or 5 years of spending, countless hours looking at and analyzing school yearbooks, I feel even more strongly about the fact that they really are truly cringy
Oh,
documents.
yeah. They
But
really
also
are.
incredibly, like, I would also just wanna emphasize that although they have always sort of circulated north of the border as well, I mean, they really are primarily something that has sort of taken form and been part of American culture, in particular, the United States, not even just North America, but really, they're really part of Americana. And one of the things that's most surprising to me is how few people have written about them. Because I actually think there's something that, one of the things that you if you walk into someone's house and they don't have a lot of books on the shelf, they'll often have, a few National Geographics, and maybe they'll have an atlas or a dictionary, and they'll have their high school yearbooks. So
Wow.
they're actually one of the few books that people have in their home across all different kinds of regions and class locations. And it is surprising to me that they've been as neglected as they have been, both in pop culture, but also by researchers.
Well, thank you for bringing it to life. And we talked a little bit about the Internet Archive, and maybe if we have just a few minutes left, and as you concluded your book, talking about how these things actually became digitized and where amateur researchers might be able to find them.
So, yeah, one of the surprising things I discovered early on when I was working on the book, it was actually the beginning of the pandemic. And so realized I was going to have to do a lot of the research online. I realized quickly that most of my research was online and I was never going to have to go to an archive. And I came across something called the Yearbook Project. And I thought, this is an interesting. It's actually was attached to a prison labor program in Oklahoma. And it turns out that for over a decade, many school yearbooks were being scanned free of charge. So entire collections from public libraries, historical societies were being scanned with no charge, often by convicted sex offenders in a prison labor program where they were being paid about
I
20
see.
cents an hour. So
Right.
that was surprising. What it means, though, it was very exciting for people from many public libraries and historical societies would have never had money to engage in a massive digitization project of a collection of this nature. So a lot of those books, some of them only live on the Historical Society's website or the public library's website. A lot of them are in the Internet Archive, which anyone can access. The largest collection, though, as most people know, is on Ancestry.com. So if you're already on Ancestry, you have access to roughly 500,000 school yearbooks, almost all from the United States. And generally, they're yearbooks that were published between about, the early 20th century and the late 20th century.
Okay.
So if anyone wants to, find their own yearbook or just look at other people's yearbooks, that is where they're all living. The other place they're living is aggregated data. Places like Truth Finder and other kinds of people search platforms
Okay.
have scraped information from yearbooks, and that's now used to put us under surveillance. So
Right.
that
Whether that be local law enforcement or old high school crushes.
and as we say in the book, Mark, our yearbooks are coming back to haunt us. And it
Yeah.
seems kind of appropriate, right? Like they sort of, were putting us under surveillance or calling us out in high school in a very kind of overt and immediate way. And now they're coming back to haunt us.
Well, to view the hauntings on the Internet Archive or Ancestry.com. I had no idea. I had done my genealogy through Ancestry. I had no idea they had the yearbook. So maybe when I have some free time, I'll check that out for some cringe moments. And how can people find out more about you, Kate?
Well, because I've spent my entire career writing books that critique social media, I'm not really on social media, but I always say
Good for you.
if you just Google me, my my various books and articles, etc., will, invariably pop up.
All right. Well, Kate, the author of School Yearbook, The Untold Story of a Cringey Tradition and Its Digital Afterlife. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Mark.
All Across America is produced by me, Marco Vig, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Visit us on Instagram at All Across America. Check out our website, allacrossamerica.com. There's an interactive map with all our episodes, and there's a Contact Us page where you can send your reactions, guest ideas, and suggestions. So get in touch, stay connected. To me, that's what podcasting is all about. Thanks for listening.